A beloved schoolteacher has been strangled to death. The man now charged with her murder is 37-year-old Jason Palmer, her live-in boyfriend. Court records show this wasn't the first time violence entered their home. Rachel had survived past incidents of abuse, but this time she did not get to walk away. She leaves behind 2 children, and Palmer is now behind bars, held on a multi-million-dollar bond.
We have a well-founded fear that Jason Palmer will retaliate against Rachel's children and her family.
I'm Kennedi Walker, and you're watching Law and Crime. Rachel Prince was an art teacher. She reportedly taught her students to find the beauty in everything. But behind the paintings and classroom smiles, Rachel was fighting to survive. The beloved art teacher had spent years in an abusive relationship, according to police, and on July 12th, that violence turned deadly. Jason Palmer appeared in court as details of Rachel's final moments were read aloud.
Miss Prince was observed lying on the concrete sidewalk with the defendant on top of her. The defendant then picked Miss Prince up and carried and dragged her into the apartment.
Detectives say no one entered or exited the apartment that night until Palmer left the next morning around 7. Police say Rachel's cause of death was strangulation, and she suffered blunt force trauma to her head and arms. Palmer is now charged with murder and being held on a $10 million bond. But court records reveal this was not the first time Rachel had suffered. Documents show Palmer had a long history of domestic violence against her. In November of 2023, he was charged with domestic violence, knowingly causing physical harm. The charge was dismissed, but he pleaded guilty to aggravated menacing. The domestic violence charge arose after Palmer allegedly threatened to kill everyone in Rachel's house, causing the mother and her 2 children to huddle behind a bed, according to documents obtained by WSYX. In September of last year, Rachel was hospitalized after Palmer allegedly assaulted her, attempting to suffocate her 3 separate times and kicking her in the head. Another charge was filed against Palmer, this time for strangulation, substantial risk of serious physical harm. That charge was also ultimately dismissed, reportedly because he pleaded guilty to misdemeanor domestic violence. He was sentenced to 180 days in jail, but with credit for time already served, he walked free. Now, Rachel is dead. Her family and students are left grieving a woman who spent her life helping others see the world through creativity and color. She taught her students to find beauty in every line, shape, and stroke. Her classroom may forever be quiet, but the lessons she gave live on in every life she touched. And here to break down this story with me is criminal defense attorney Diane Menashe. Diane, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me.
So let's just jump right in. I mean, we often hear the system failed, but in your legal opinion, where exactly did it break down here?
Well, I read in preparation for today sort of the history of the domestic violence, if you will, with this couple. I'm not really sure that the system broke down as much as we know just sort of the human condition and why these sort of relationships come to be and why they continue to sustain themselves, right? Like, he was on probation for a period of time. I read that she at one point had asked that the protective order be lifted. The judge actually denied that request and kept the protective order in place, and he was actually on probation at the time of this offense. So I really don't think this is a case of the justice system failing. I think it's just more of what we know about these types of relationships is that they're episodic, right? And they go on far too long than they should.
Absolutely. And I mean, if someone is convicted of domestic violence, why isn't that just an automatic barrier to returning to the same home?
Well, it really depends if you're convicted of domestic violence and you're put on probation. The victim obviously has input as to whether they want a stay away, whether that would be a protective order or a condition of probation. And in so many of these cases, because of the domestic nature of them, couples reconcile and they get back together. And so often the victims, like in this case, say that they want to reconcile and not have that protective measure in place. It's not uncommon, certainly.
This is a Law and Crime legal alert. If you received Depo-Provera birth control shots and were later diagnosed with a brain or spinal tumor called meningioma, you may be eligible for a lawsuit. Morgan & Morgan is investigating claims that patients weren't properly warned about this risk. It's free to check, takes just a few minutes, and you don't pay unless they win. So scan the QR code on your screen, click the link below, or go to forthepeople.com/LCDepo to see if you qualify. I know that just reading it, and I'm not a lawyer, but I was just confused as to why he wasn't locked up. Police documented repeated abuse. She was hospitalized. What else legally has to happen before someone is considered truly dangerous?
Well, I think we need to look also at what he was convicted of, right? The one domestic violence they have, he was convicted of the lowest level misdemeanor, which was this disorderly conduct that we have here in Ohio. A disorderly conduct is like walking out of a bar and kind of being loud and obnoxious. It's truly the lowest level misdemeanor you can have absent a traffic ticket. I think that they seemingly had a volatile history, but there wasn't any, injuries that were so severe to constitute him ever being charged with a felony previously, right? He has no history of being charged with a felonious assault or strangulation, felony level. So while I can understand from the outside, perspective, it looks like they had this really violent history together. I would say it looks actually like he has one conviction for disorderly conduct and some other complaints.
And I guess I'm confused about, just not having the felonies and just the strangulation, because just reading those documents, it seems like one of the times that police was called to the home and they saw the bruises on her neck, they saw these types of things. Just if it was documented, why that didn't, matter.
Well, I don't know if it didn't matter. I think, every prosecutor looks to see if the alleged victim is willing to participate, if they want the case to move forward. That's always one of the biggest considerations. So I think, when you see that there's a police run and there's visible injuries and then there's no charges filed, we sort of generally think the first thing is that the alleged victim just didn't want to move forward with charges, didn't want to press forward. And so a decision was made based on their wishes. I don't think, and I know optics look like this is the system failing, but there's so much more at play with these types of cases given these relationships. Prosecutors, rightly so, they defer to victims, whether it's asking victims under Marcy's Law here in Ohio what types of punishment, and resolutions they want in a case, and also whether they even want to prosecute a case.
Could the prosecution argue that Rachel's murder wasn't a standalone event, but the end result of years of escalating abuse?
Well, I certainly would anticipate that when he's indicted and the case moves forward, should he go to trial, I would certainly presume that the state of Ohio will try to fold in this prior behavior under 404B. And have the jury hear the holistic, story of their relationship, not just the one day at issue when she was killed.
And earlier, just a moment ago, we spoke about how one of the charges was pled down to a misdemeanor. If someone does plead down to a misdemeanor, how much does that weaken the system's ability to stop them the next time?
I think obviously, when we're talking about misdemeanor offenses, the maximum possible penalty is, 6 months of local incarceration, and we know that individuals to really be rehabilitated need more than 6 months, right? Whether it's alcohol or drugs or anger, you need, ongoing treatment and participation. You need community support. You need to buy in. You need to want to change. So I guess that's a long way to say, I think the system didn't fail in this way, that he was convicted of something and he was put on probation. I think this is, just a situation where seemingly, right, it was escalating conduct. That said, he certainly enjoys the presumption of innocence. I know these prior acts are certainly being talked about, and I know that there was an eyewitness that said that he saw him and her on the sidewalk outside. But as he stands today, he's presumed innocent, and the state of Ohio, to convict him, will have to prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt.
Now, the strangulation, it showed up in some of Rachel's reports. Why do you think strangulation still isn't treated as a mandatory felony in every state? Because to me, when someone is strangling you, it seems like attempted murder. I know it's not the same thing, but.
I will say here in Ohio, we have an F4 and a felony of the 4th degree and now a felony of the 3rd degree strangulation. I'm seeing strangulation charged as felonies all the time now. So, I know that that's not universally true across the country, but I can tell you with just heightened awareness of domestic violence issues and really the point you're making, right, is that we can't having a misdemeanor conviction isn't enough oftentimes to really prevent the type of future behavior that we want to prevent. And so I'm seeing prosecutors across the state indict on these felony strangulation matters. And I think there's more to come for the exact reasons that you've touched on, right? Like, how do we stop this future behavior? Certainly a felony conviction, facing prison time, going to prison, longer, possibilities of probation. Those are all deterrent. Those are all things that will possibly deter future behavior.
And I understand, we can't blame the system for everything, but just, you've been doing this for a long time. In your legal opinion, what more could have been done legally to keep Rachel's alleged killer away from her, even if she didn't initiate action?
Well, I mean, I think this goes back to, like, is it so much about the system, or is it about understanding how this couple, right, this union could have gotten individually, right, some treatment to help them either distance themselves from the treatment, or distance themselves from one another, or if they were going to stay together, like how to break this cycle. I think this is more just of, like, we know this pattern behavior of abuse and how women stay and circle back. And we know, the nature of the escalation of violence within a relationship. I just think it's more internal than more blaming the system in these instances. I really do.
In your experience, is fear the biggest factor preventing survivors from testifying, or is it something else?
Well, I don't think it's fear necessarily. I think that, when I say these, I'm certainly creating big categories, but these types of relationships are really based in what they believe is love. And it's very confusing, right? How someone that you love so much and presumably loves you could treat you like this. I think it's very difficult to try to unwrap that emotional piece of these relationships. Like, these people loved each other. And then, I think unpacking it is really difficult. And then testifying against someone that you love or loved. I think that's really complex. I just do. I'm not sure it's fear-based. I think it's more just, it's a lot to wrap your head around. And as we know, we often shouldn't use emotions as our compass, but we're humans and we do.
Right. And one thing that I've noticed, clearly, adults are adults, we make our own decisions, but it seems like with children, the legal system, it just from the outside looking in, it appears like they step in more. Like, despite what someone may be saying, despite what a person doesn't want, they still may make that final decision. So in cases with adults and domestic violence, when, like how you said, sometimes it's emotion based, and they may not truly know what they want, or they never think that a person that they love is capable of killing them. I mean, is that when a judge can legally step in? I mean, can a judge legally bar someone from living in the same home after a domestic violence charge, or does that require a separate court order?
Well, I mean, certainly there's the protective order piece, which would last here in Ohio for 5 years, which would allow him not to get within 500 feet of her. He's also on probation, and there could be a probationary term where he's not to have any contact with her. But from what I've read, she was willingly having contact with him during this period of time, right? They were, and I again think, what we were just talking about. Here's an individual who's a teacher. I mean, I think we can all presume that she's a smart individual, right? And I think this goes back to why these cases are so complex. If they were so easy to figure out, we literally wouldn't have domestic violence anymore. I mean, if we could just riddle through this, we'd get rid of this problem. But it is so complex because that emotional piece is always at the root of the problem.
Now, a $10 million bond for the suspect. I mean, that's a high number. But is it symbolic? Yeah. Is it symbolic, or does it actually protect the public?
Well, it's definitely protecting the public, because that's a 10%, post that you'd lose. I think, it was the judge saying, I don't want to give you bond, but I'm going to give you a bond because I'm presumptively supposed to, and here's your 10 million, right? But it's keeping the individual incarcerated for sure. And I think that's the message it's sending. And I also think it's just publicly sending a message just generally that these types of cases will be taken very seriously.
Have you ever heard of a bond being that high?
Oh, sure. Particularly you would expect sort of in an aggravated murder case, this is, as it's just been charged right now, as a straight murder. But, the $10 million, I don't think is, once you kind of get to 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, the judge is really just sending a signal that, I'm giving you a bond, but not one you're going to be able to post.
Right. Well, can a judge factor in the totality of someone's violent history or only their most recent charge?
Oh no, for purposes of the bond, right, they're considering the risk and safety of the community, and certainly someone's entire criminal history is very much part of that consideration.
Right. And then we know that the victim had two children, and that was argued about, oh, just the children being afraid and wanting him to be locked up. Well, just wondering if someone keeps reoffending, even while out on previous charges, which is what, of course, the defendant is accused of. Does the court ever get penalized for letting that happen?
No, I mean, there's no way to penalize the court or rightfully so the prosecutor, right? I mean, these are complex matters, and I think the way the system works is if you're convicted of a misdemeanor domestic violence, and then you have a second one, then that will elevate that charge to a felony offense, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there are certainly ways within our criminal justice system that are in place to punish like repeat offenders. It's just that this case wasn't there. And I think just from what I've read, this was very complex in terms of, the sort of wanting to be together and then not together and the complexity that brings in these types of cases.
And just speaking more about the complexity, I mean, do you think domestic violence is still seen as a private matter in parts of the legal system?
I mean, don't you think? I think domestic violence is still seen as a private matter in our culture, and then by the way, I think that one thing we don't talk about often is domestic violence as a whole. We don't talk about it with men against women. We don't talk about it with women against men. Like domestic violence is really, so prevalent within our culture, society, relationships. I just think it's something that we don't talk about often enough until these types of situations. And I think if we obviously did talk about it more and had a better understanding as to how these relationships are created and how they sustain, we could probably really start to chip away at the problem.
Do we see the charges getting upgraded?
There's definitely going to be, I would presume, other felony charges in addition to the murder. I wouldn't be surprised if it becomes an aggravated murder case. I'm assuming there'll be a felonious assault, a strangulation felony level included in the indictment. I think we should all, in a kidnapping, based on what I've read, I think we should all anticipate. I would expect, 5, 6, 7 felony charges to be included in an indictment.
If that happens, I mean, are we looking at a potential death penalty case?
I don't see this as a death penalty case based on the facts I know. I don't think it statutorily qualifies. I will also tell you, I do a lot of death penalty work here in Ohio and Franklin County. This is historically over the last 5 years not a county that is indicting cases as death cases. That can always change, but I can just tell you that in the last 5 or so years, that's been the practice here within this county.
Are prosecutors incentivized to move fast on cases like this, or does the system reward resolution over prevention?
Well, I think we know they've got to move fast because they only have 10 days to indict him because he's remaining incarcerated. So that's why there's that preliminary hearing date. That's the date by which the state of Ohio has to indict him or dismiss it. And if they dismissed it, he'd be released. So we can anticipate an indictment within 10 days. And I think beyond that, in a case like this, I don't think there's incentives for the state to rush this through. I think this is a case where obviously discovery will have to be, supplied and reviewed. I think there's going to be a lot of negotiations, investigation. I mean, I can't say it enough. I mean, he's presumed innocent at this point. But I think a murder case of this type, we should expect that it'll take between indictment and resolution, whether that's a plea, a trial, et cetera. I think we're thinking at least a year.
What could a plea look like in this case?
I mean, it's really based on sort of the strength of the evidence, right? And the mitigation, if any, that the defense could put forth on behalf of their client. But, here in Ohio, just the murder count carries 15 years to life. So the individual, if convicted of a murder, would be sentenced to a life sentence with the first possibility of parole after 15 full years. And you could get continued to be flopped for your entire life. So it is truly a life sentence. If he is charged with aggravated murder, the aggravated murder statute here now in Ohio carries life without the possibility of parole. So we're talking some serious consequences for this individual potentially.
What strategy do you expect the defense to use, especially if prior abuse is a major part of the prosecution's case?
Yeah, I mean, I think just kind of reading it is there's this presumption, right? And I've certainly done a lot of cases where, the husbands are charged with killing their wives, and this is similar in nature just because of the boyfriend-girlfriend component. I think it's really trying to understand and separate that, like, prior behavior and those instances doesn't mean that he's committed this offense, right? They're not one and the same. And I think that that's whoever defense attorney gets on this case is definitely going to try to separate sort of the past from the present. Was there any other individuals that she was seeing, anyone else that had access to her, anyone else that was around that day? I'm guessing that, forensic evidence, particularly cell phone data, cell site, search engine histories, I think those things will all become very important in a case like this, just to see what's happening the day prior, is there escalating arguments? Are there no arguments, right? How are they getting along? How are they communicating? I'm guessing all of those types of things will become very relevant as this case unfolds.
And lastly, before I let you go, I mean, of course, we hear about these tragic stories almost every day, it seems like. But could this case in particular maybe change, how Ohio or other states treat repeat domestic violence offenders?
I don't think any one case should change sort of the trajectory of our justice system. I think certainly any one case can cause all of us to sort of look inward, right, and think more objectively about, issues like domestic violence, right? And if we know someone that's in a relationship that seems unhealthy or, dangerous, right? Like, build a community around that person. I think that these kinds of cases can bring about a heightened awareness, but I don't personally think any one case should be, the grounds for systemically changing our justice system, whether it be here in Ohio or globally. But it certainly creates, and I hope, a bigger conversation about domestic violence.
Absolutely. Well, this is a case that we will be following closely. Diane, thank you so much for coming on today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Jason Palmer will be back in court on July 25th. Rachel's family made a GoFundMe page. All donations will go directly to her 2 children. For Law and Crime, I'm Kennedi Walker.